So good morning, everyone. Welcome again to our series on the road to zero carbon post COP26. It's been great to have so many of you join us for previous webinars, and having had now a little bit of time since COP26, more than 100 days has passed, and with many sort of mixed messages from politicians around what the next steps are on the road to net zero, we thought it was an opportune time to get another great panel of speakers together to discuss what those next steps might be. So I'd like to introduce who we're going to be hearing from today. First up, there'll be Peter Cole from Transport for the North to talk about how to take some of these strategies to action, forward to action. Secondly, we'll have Dr. Caroline Mullen from the University of Leeds talking about the importance of equity and inclusive transitions when considering carbon reduction. Following that, we'll have Alex Penn from the University of Surrey looking at a whole systems approach to carbon. And finally, we'll finish off with our own Dr. David Connolly from Systra to talk a little bit more about different toolkits that can get you on a pathway to net zero. So I think there's a really good range of practical applications and next steps to consider over the next hour and a half. So we'll hear from each of those speakers, and then there'll be time for Q&A discussion at the end. So please, I would encourage your active participation. There is a Q&A function within the webinar, and I please ask you to post your questions in there. There is also a chat function, but please use the Q&A as that will be where we'll be taking the questions from for our panelists. So I think without further ado, we'll get straight on to our first presenter, Peter. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, hello, everybody. Really pleased to be invited to talk at this post COP26 event, because I think pre COP26, I was invited to quite a few events, and it's really noticeable to me that there's been a scaling down in activity and awareness just when we need to be ramping up the message and, of course, putting our shoulder to the wall in terms of actual implementation. And I'd reflect on what Katie said about 100 days having passed since COP, and the most recent report from the IPCC, which said that we basically need to reach peak emissions by 2025. So we've got 100 days gone since COP, and we have just 1,338 days to go. Not long. So moving on from COP, I've just got a quick slide here about finding your place, both I think on a personal level, but also for your organization. If you're listening today and you don't know how your organization fits into that wider decarbonisation picture and the role it plays, and I think that's really the first thing you need to do, and pretty quickly. And for TfN, as a subnational transport body, the government has made it pretty clear, actually. In their transport decarbonisation plan published last year, the government talked about STBs ensuring consistency across local areas and capitalising on economies of scale. And then this year, they've published the National EV Strategy, which is actually more prescriptive about our role, in particular around leading the assessment of demand across regions and developing tools to assist local authorities and distribution network operators in charge point rollout. And actually, that sort of role can be played out when you look at the wider gamut of transport decarbonisation measures, like reducing car use and encouraging modal share. And that really frames our activities going forward. And we'd actually published a consultation draft of our own decarbonisation strategy before either of those national strategies came along. And that spelt out what we felt our role was, and actually some of the activities to get running with. And I guess fairly fortunately, those early activities very much reflect how governments see our role around decarbonisation. And I'm just going to touch upon a few of them now. One of the activities we've already commenced, and arguably the most important in the short term, is TfN's Clean Mobility Visions workstream. So demand management and modal shift is a real priority for us. And the overarching aim of this workstream is to provide robust evidence for our local authorities to help them justify those really tough and often politically charged decisions around road infrastructure and parking provision, as well as active travel and public transport provision. And the project really has two parts. The first is developing policy packages, and the second part is about communicating them. And the key thing is that those policies are evidence-based, but also contextualized, recognizing the differences in our places, that they're realistic, and that they're quantified so that they can be used by local authorities in their LTPs to provide those quantified emissions reduction pathways that DfT have requested. And decarbonisation isn't the only consideration, and this work is also going to consider the wider impact themes associated with reduced car usage. And we feel that that can provide some additional weight behind the decisions that need to be made. So we'll be looking at things like health and well-being, social inclusion, accessibility, and local economy. And whilst we're doing that, we'll be collecting evidence around perceptions and attitudes. And I think that's really key to compiling effective policy packages, because the measures that in theory can give you the biggest carbon emissions reductions won't always be the most effective measures if you haven't considered societal readiness. And to that end, we're looking at how we can pilot and potentially more widely employ the University of Lancaster's societal readiness tool, which has been developed through the Decarbonate programme. And the second policy area that we've started to progress actions against is low and zero emission vehicles. And last year, we embarked on developing an electric vehicle charging infrastructure framework for the North. And this slide shows in quite a simplistic way how we've gone about that study. As part of phase one, which we've already completed, we've built an EV charge model, and we've integrated that into our existing analytical framework. So that's our transport models and land use models within TFN. And that essentially allows us to look at where and how much charge is needed on our major road network in the North over 5-year increments into the future. And we've focused on the major road network, and that essentially includes our A roads and strategic road network in our patch, because that's where our local authorities saw TFN being able to provide the most value, but it also picks up those cross-boundary trips that often fall through the gaps. But of course, to get to that, we actually have to take a ground-up approach, and we actually have charge demand data down to an MSOA level, including the types of chargers and looking at charging behaviour. And we hope that we can roll that out to our local authority partners in a matter of weeks. Another work stream is to do with hydrogen. So late last year, we helped lead the development of a cross-sectoral consortium alongside Northern Gas Networks. And that includes Heriot-Watt and Durham universities, as well as Element Energy, Rise Hydrogen, and Eversholt Rail. And the consortium prepared a bid for, and we were subsequently successful in securing a first round of Ofgem SIF funding. And that's for a project to develop a multimodal hydrogen transport refueling network study. And it's got two work streams, that project. And it's firstly, we want to evaluate the potential for hydrogen's use in heavy duty transport across the North. So that's things like HGVs, buses, RCVs, and rail. And then create a joined up regional strategy of how we can cost effectively kickstart the hydrogen economy in the North, whilst directly supporting the growth of zero emission transport and the repurposing of our gas grid. And the second work stream is to evidence the cost and systems benefits of hydrogen by actually building out several high capacity hydrogen refueling stations to prove the concept and strategy actually at scale, and then communicate that to other regions. So that's three of the biggest activities defined within our strategy already progressing. Now, TFN, as part of its statutory responsibilities, holds a strategic transport plan, and embedded within it is a preferred programme of transport investment for the North stretching out to 2050. And the organisers of this event today wanted me to briefly just explore some of the issues around embodied carbon in relation to proposed transport infrastructure. And I'm not going to dwell on the part that embodied carbon plays in the overall transport decarbonisation picture, but suffice it to say that the embodied carbon in our forward investments is both significant and I think largely uncalculated or perhaps disregarded when it comes to setting both national and local whole economy decarbonisation targets. And I hope we'll be able to spend a decent watch of time in a Q&A on this topic to explore it more, but I just want to put some ideas out there which might stir some debate. And the first is around the usefulness of trying to consider embodied carbon at a strategic level. So we know that in theory, the earlier you consider carbon in a project, the more the carbon reduction potential, mainly because you can choose not to do that project at all, or perhaps to achieve the same outcomes with a wholly different solution. But at a strategic level, when you've just got lines from point A to B, how robust can we actually be in terms of carbon appraisal? It's coming up with a possible range of embodied carbon for projects or whole programs useful. And recognizing that the appraisal may only give us a wide range, and that all of those schemes are also held in the development programs elsewhere by delivery authorities. Are we actually adding any value? And I think the argument for looking at embodied carbon at a strategic level is twofold. It starts to set early expectations. So whilst it may be useful to use the findings to help prioritize or reprioritizing the sequencing of the delivery of projects within a program, I actually think the most useful thing is that it allows us to understand what needs to be true in terms of the wider transport policy context to allow us to build out these schemes to maximize those social and economic and environmental benefits while still remaining within our carbon budgets. And secondly, by understanding what the best case is in terms of embodied carbon for our programs at a strategic level, can we set more consistent and better informed minimum requirements in terms of construction carbon reduction targets for the projects within those programs? And how can bottom-up embodied carbon appraisal inform those strategic benchmarks and give us some consistency? And finally, the second question is around the use of infrastructure carbon budgets. We have national projections within the national strategies for emissions from car use. We've got them for aviation. We've got them for all sorts of operational emissions. But what's the budget we've got for the embodied carbon used in building things? Do we have one? Is there any budget laid aside? Building anything uses carbon. And it seems to me quite possible that it's carbon that's not been accounted for in any budgets or national projections to net zero. But not building anything can't be the answer, can it? Personally, I don't think it's the answer. Decarbonisation isn't the only game in town. There are often really strong economic, social, and local environmental drivers for building that transport infrastructure. But I do think budgets are important. Decision makers understandably find it really hard to contextualize how significant the embodied carbon from a particular project is when it's compared to a whole economy figure or cross-sectoral carbon footprint. And that frequently happens at the moment. So if decision makers were operating in a world where a project had to compete for its share of a programmatic carbon budget, perhaps that would make for better decisions. Carbon is finite, just like funding, and perhaps we need to see all programs existing within a carbon envelope just as they do within a funding envelope. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's a good one to start us off with, and as you say, a few things to think about for the panel discussion later. I think, given the time, unless anybody's got any burning questions, that we should perhaps move straight on, and we can return to those discussions about embodied carbon, particularly later on. Just a reminder, though, to attendees that you're very welcome to ask questions in that Q&A box, and there is also the chat box available, which might be useful for further conversation. So if I could ask for questions in that Q&A box and any further broader discussion points to be kept to the chat, please. And with that in mind, we'll move on to see what Caroline has got to tell us about inclusive transitions. Welcome, Caroline.
Right, so yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I want to talk a little bit about inclusive transitions to low carbon mobility. And I think the first thing to say about this, if I can actually get my slides move on, is that low carbon mobility and socially inclusive mobility can be the same thing, and they absolutely should be the same thing. The Venn diagram should just be a circle. The problem is, if we don't get it right, and if we're not thinking about low carbon transitions as inclusive transitions, that we're going to fail on both scores. So we're going to fail in terms of inclusion, and we're going to fail in terms of low carbon mobility. And one of the things that I'm really going to focus on here is how this sort of push to car dependence is something that's absolutely a matter of social inclusion, social exclusion, often financial hardship. So it's not just that there's compatibility between inclusion and low carbon mobility, that they're mutually reinforcing if we get it right. If we get it wrong, see, we're going to fail on both scores, and it can actually be a distraction. We could be doing things that look like we're trying to make progress, whereas actually we're not really dealing with the big issues. So socially inclusive low carbon mobility, the really, really short version is doing everything we can to remove barriers to mobility that doesn't rely on private cars. And by barriers, I mean anything that makes it difficult. So sometimes you could just about manage journeys, but they can have quite a sort of large detrimental impact on people's lives for all sorts of reasons. And sometimes it's just impossible. So sometimes people are excluded because they just can't make the journeys that they need to do. And although we all know this, it's absolutely bread and butter, we need to keep at the front of our thinking just how important mobility, long distance, short distance, just moving around a neighbourhood, how vital it is for just about everything that we do in our lives. So I'd argue that removing the barriers to non-car mobility matters obviously for decarbonisation. It matters for people who haven't got a car, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It matters for people that are pushed into car dependence and really struggle to be able to afford a car. And as Peter talked about, there's so many other reasons why reducing reliance on private vehicles will improve people's health in terms of air quality, in terms of ability to take exercise, quality of life, built a natural environment. And we know all of this, it's right up there. And we're also pretty familiar with quite a lot of the reasons why it can be difficult for people to do the things that they need to do without having access to a car. So we still have this sort of reliance on, this is my sort of simple diagram of the city with the public transport corridors that we know from research and we know from our own lives often don't meet people's needs. So they either mean very long journeys for people that haven't got a vehicle, or they can be one of the factors why people just go and get a vehicle. Or in other cases, thinking about things like the school run, people can't take jobs because the transport's not there to get them to work, to school, to do those kinds of things. So there's all sorts of social and economic problems, and these are things that can either push people into car dependence or can leave people excluded. We also know, again, from research and from experience, that our mobility system is a barrier to active travel for all sorts of reasons, but one of the big reasons is traffic is a threat. It's a threat to walking and cycling. We know from research evidence that as much as we can encourage people to take up cycling, if people don't feel safe cycling, they're not going to do it. Walking's a bit different, and I think there's more to be done on the reasons for that, but perhaps one of the reasons is that a lot of people don't have another option. But walking through polluted areas is obviously bad for physical health. There's also quite long-standing evidence that it's bad for mental health. So people might have to do it, but it's bad for them. Again, if people have got an option, this can be another thing that pushes people into car dependence. And when we're thinking about this, there can be quite sort of small gaps in walking and cycling connectivity, but that can mean that a whole journey isn't viable without a car. If you can't get over that gap, then the whole thing's out. Some of the evidence for the extent to which people are pushed into car dependence. So I'm not saying that there aren't people that are really attached to their car, but we do have evidence that for a lot of people this isn't the case, that they're really pushed into it. My colleague Giulio Mattioli has done work on looking at the relationship between car dependence and economic stress. He's looked at this across Europe, and there's a similar pattern in countries across Europe where you have, so this is one of his graphs from the UK, but as I said, it's a similar pattern across Europe. People with material deprivation as measured by the EU, so that there's a standard for that, and that's not being able to afford sort of what are considered essential items, nevertheless own a car. So it's not, it's obviously not a majority, and you can see from this graph it tends to be in the lower income deciles. And what this shows is that despite not being able to afford basics, people are nevertheless using a car, owning a car, and going into financial stress because of that. So it's an indication that there's something going on here. It's certainly not just a matter of choice. Other research that we did found that whereas as transport planners, there tends to be an assumption that people choose where to live, they choose where to work, and they think about accessibility when they're doing that. We found that the housing system, the employment system, particularly in this country, but also in other places, means that people don't have very much choice. They don't necessarily have very much choice about where to live, but the other thing is they very often don't have much choice about when to move. So things happen, people have to move home. Often, particularly with the rented sector, there's no fault evictions, but there's also people have got, family changes, relationship changes mean that they have to move. People can be repossessed, and social housing can fall through for all sorts of reasons. So for lots and lots of reasons, people often don't have the choice about when to move. And when they do have to move unexpectedly, they're really, transport's not up there in what they're thinking about. Likewise with jobs, even people in quite sort of, they've got stable jobs, they're full-time jobs, the location of the job can often move. And again, this means that you're suddenly making a journey that you didn't plan. You had no option to think about accessibility. And these are often quite complex journeys, and we found evidence for this. So this can be, the transport implications of this is that some people realizing this decide to get a car, because if they do have to make these complex journeys, at least they can actually do them. Again, we found financial stress in keeping the car because of this. And some people were forced to give up work because they could no longer make journeys, or forced to give up continuing education. So quite sort of profound implications for people's lives. And the transport part of this is that people are making quite complex journeys that are not met by public transport, and where walking and cycling can be difficult in current conditions. So what to do about this is, I think what's really important is to think about connectivity with public transport, with micromobility, as we're starting to see this brought in, and with walking and cycling routes. So we often look at the high volume routes. We look at the cycling corridors, we look at public transport corridors. And I think what's really important, because we're seeing that people are making these quite complex journeys, is to really focus on what can be low volume routes, what can be small breaks in walking and cycling network. So, it's fine, but then it gives out, and it's the bit that gives out that's the problem. It's for each one of those links, it's not necessarily very many people using it, but it's a mistake to think that we should just be focusing on the high volume routes. Thinking about this connectivity is, I think, incredibly important for inclusion, for making it possible for people to do the things they need to do without access to a car. And I'm absolutely not naive as to the challenges of this. Funding is always going to be a problem. We know public transport's in a state of crisis almost. It's very difficult to get funding for walking and cycling, even though the strategies, the funding for that compared to other aspects of transport is actually quite small. What I'd say is, if we think about the environmental, so in terms of decarbonisation, but wider environmental impacts, and the social and economic impacts of inclusion, of improved health, there's a cost, there's a funding case to be made here. The challenge is always that we're trying to put a value on something that's not immediate, and the pressure is to do the immediate things. But we already value fairly abstract things when we look at things like road schemes. We value the value of time savings. So we're already doing this. Perhaps we're not doing it in the right way. So perhaps we need to think quite hard about the way in which we make these funding cases. And I think Peter was talking a bit about this in relation to embodied carbon. And the other challenge is in rethinking how we quantify interventions and how we quantify the benefits of interventions. So as I've been trying to emphasize in this, we really need to be focusing on the connectivity, and that can mean focusing on routes that have only got a small number of people, on links that are only used by a small number of people, but which combined could bring an awful lot of people into the, make it possible for them to do what they need to do without relying on the car. So the quantification, I think it's a mistake to be looking at the quantification at the level of an individual intervention, and we should be looking at quantification at the sort of network level, thinking about the high volume of people that are pushed into car dependence or pushed into exclusion because they don't have the transport they need, they can't make the journeys that they need to be able to do, and think about that volume. So the volume of people that can benefit and the environmental benefits of a consistent policy of looking at connectivity, looking at fixing broken networks and looking at it in that way. And so really we need to rethink quantification. We need safe, continuous walking and cycling routes. There's lots and lots of evidence for this in relation to cycling. For walking, I actually think the social inclusion case is stronger than for cycling, even though more people walk, they're walking in conditions that aren't healthy for them, that they don't feel safe. There's other people that could be, would find it easier to do more of what they need to do through walking and cycling if we look at these safe, continuous routes. We need, as difficult as it is, to look at public transport on low volume routes. We can think about the role of shared micromobility in this. And again, it's really thinking about where do we put, if we're putting in schemes for micromobility, they need to be located where there's social need, not just necessarily where there's high volumes of people who perhaps have other transport options. And think about, if we are bringing in micromobility, think about the space that we give to that. So not just competing with space that's already for, there for walking and cycling, which is already sort of pinched. And that's all I want to say, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. And again, yeah, a few things that we'd no doubt want to pick up, as you say, particularly around the quantification and the funding cases, I think, in the Q&A. And there've been some comments in the chat about the importance of gaps in and how it can just be a missing link that pulls the whole sort of walking and cycling network down, as we're all too familiar with. There's one quick question I wanted to pick up from this, and it's sort of quite specific. Someone's asked, is inclusive mobility the same as gender equality, which seems to be a focus of the transport planning community at the moment?
It includes gender equality, and there's no way I'm going to do this justice here. So yeah, absolutely. And it's perhaps more than just making, it's recognizing that the diversity of needs that people have. So absolutely, inclusive mobility includes gender. Yeah, and it's not just about the same provision for everyone. It really is taking account of that different people have different needs, both in terms of their travel practices, but also in terms of what's going to work for them, what's physically accessible, what people feel safe doing.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. There's another quick question as well, which if you can't answer now, we can return to later. But someone's mentioned that when they were looking at a study in Glasgow, they identified 40% of people were in transport poverty. And have you sort of found have you got a percentage or a scale of who that sort of forgotten group of people is in terms of those that are in transport poverty?
It's So Giulio Mattioli tried to develop an indicator around this. It's very difficult because there's going to be questions about any sort of indicators, and that's one of the things that he came up with. So he was looking at a combination of inability to be able to pay for transport and having to make complex journeys. So if you can do everything you need to do by walking and cycling locally, and it's all good, you don't need to spend out as much. Now that's not the case for most people, but it's what you bring into that indicator. So it'd be really interesting to look at the Glasgow work to see that. But on the sort of low income, high sort of fuel costs, Giulio thought there was about 10%, but that was a few years ago. So that's almost certainly changed now.
As you say,
a lot more excluded by not being able to make journeys, not feeling safe traveling.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to think about it in that sense. And, it does have implications, interesting points you were making about the priorities that people put and what that means in terms of polluting vehicles and who's able to afford different types of transport as well. So no doubt themes we'll return to in the Q&A as well. But I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much for that, Caroline. And I'd like to move on next to Alex to look at the whole systems approach in terms of carbon reduction. Thanks, Alex.
Hi, so I'm Alex Penn, and I'm going to talk to you about taking a whole systems approach to transport decarbonisation. This is work I've done with colleagues on the Anticipate project who are listed below. So when we look at transport decarbonisation, or really, most big policy challenges, we have a huge challenge in that we're looking at working with complex systems. So transport systems, for example, they're embedded in and interact with social, economic, political, environmental and physical systems, which are composed of multiple interacting factors across multiple different domains. We have very many interconnections and interdependencies. These transport systems, they also have to deliver multiple outcomes. So we don't just need to reduce carbon emissions, we simultaneously have to improve air quality, provide equitable access to services and livable places. But because of the complexity of systems like this and the interconnections, we very often see with policy interventions that we get unexpected indirect effects, and there are trade-offs between these different outcomes. And that's been seen very frequently, for example, with transport decarbonisation policy causing negative impacts on air quality. So this sort of system structure isn't normally taken into account in decision-making processes and policy design, but we actually really need methods to understand the probable causal connections between system factors to make effective policy. We use an approach called participatory systems mapping, which allows us to bring together diverse types of systems knowledge to map whole systems and stress test policy and design better interventions. So PSM is a participatory modelling methodology in which we get groups of stakeholders together in a room to collaboratively construct a simple causal model of their system, its components, the drivers and the interdependencies between all of those things. So it's a great method that really gives us quite quickly an overview of the whole system, emphasising the interactions. People build this together, and it's a really useful discussion and understanding tool in which people understand each other's perspectives. We can bring together into this model diverse knowledge about the system and different parts of the system and people's different values and perspectives on the system, and include in the model not just quantifiable and interactions or factors where we have empirical data, but qualitative and experiential data. So what really matters on the ground in policy rollout, which is often problematic in more formal modelling approaches. Once we've constructed the map, we can then do bespoke analysis on it, really focused on delivering usable insights to our stakeholders. And we've used this approach very successfully in the UK government in a number of different policy domains which share similar properties of complexity. So we have multiple interconnected domains, lack of empirical data, and potential trade-offs between different outcomes or stakeholder interests, which may need to be negotiated. So this is a very simple systems map. This was constructed in the Humber region with industrialists, local authorities, community organisations. And there's one sort of focal outcome here in orange, which is the production of energy from the bio-based economy. But what you can see is that a map includes factors from all sorts of different domains. So say from land availability development to policy to available technology, and factors that are very quantifiable, such as fossil fuel price, but also those that are very crucial but qualitative, such as community acceptance of new industrial development. And these factors are connected by causal links. Positive if the increase in one factor increases the factor it's connected to, or decreases the connecting factor, and negative if the factors change each other in opposite directions. So it's really quite a simple map that just shows us the connections between the factors. So we build maps like this, we can learn a lot from them. So we have different sorts of bespoke map analysis processes which combine network analysis and causal flow analysis with subjective information from the stakeholders. So we tailor our analysis to give relevant insights that actually answer questions that are meaningful and useful. The sorts of things that we can look at on a map like this are, for example, what are the direct influences on key system functions or outcomes? What might be the impact on the system of changes, so either policy interventions or external pressures? What interactions, trade-offs or synergies might exist between important system functions? Where might there be vulnerabilities, factors that actually influence huge numbers of things in the system that are vulnerable to change? And conversely, where might there be opportunities for effective intervention? Very influential factors that influence a lot of functions that matter, that we have the ability to control or influence, so-called levers. So we did a piece of work with the Transition Transport Clean Air Network last year, and created a giant systems map of the UK personal surface transportation system. So we worked together with transport providers, local authorities, NGOs and academics to bring together all sorts of different perspectives on the UK transport system and the transport system really in use. What is the system? How does it work? How do people use it and why? We started mapping from a real breadth of outcomes. So we weren't just interested in decarbonisation and the CO2 emissions from the system, but also the other crucial outcomes such as NO2 emissions, PM emissions, but social outcomes, mobility equity, connectivity, neighbourhood self-sufficiency, mental and physical health. Starting from these outcomes, we got people to generate factors that were influenced by them or influenced them from any domain at all, economic, social, political, whatever they thought mattered from their experience and knowledge. And then we built a causal map by connecting these factors together. And you can have a look at the map and the paper link that I think will be circulated to you in the chat. This is the map. You can see that it's extremely complex, and we wouldn't say this is a complete map of the causal network of the UK transport system, but already we can see there's an enormous amount of structure and interconnection. I won't be able to zoom in on this and show you any detail, but if you look at the link that's been put in the chat, you can actually access this online yourself in an interactive interface and explore and go through the map. So we used the map to explore the indirect effects of policy that promoting electric vehicles. So as I'm sure you're all very much aware, UK transport decarbonisation policies are really predominantly focused on measures to promote the uptake and use of electric vehicles. But there are already known issues with electric vehicles. Preliminary sort of early evidence is showing that when people buy an EV, they're actually more likely to use the EV to replacing trips that they would have previously taken with public transport or by active travel with the EV use, essentially because it's so expensive but yet cheap to use once you've bought it. So we already see that when people have EVs, we get more private vehicle miles. So a large number of EVs is very likely to lead to more private vehicles, more private vehicle miles, and hence more congestion, which has multiple negative impacts. So we traced through the map, we pulled out the section of the map showing the causal effects multiple steps away from an increased number of EVs and also from congestion. And we could see multiple negative impacts, indirect impacts of increased EV use. So a decrease in the pleasantness and livability of neighbourhoods, increased community severance and damaged local social networks, a decrease in active travel as people feel less safe with more traffic on the roads, and decreased physical and mental health from all of the above, and really negative impacts on public transport and access to affordable transport, which is very interesting. I'll go into that a bit further. And of course, as everyone knows, we do have the problem with EVs that we get increased PM emissions from tyres and brakes, and that of course has an influence on air quality. Very clearly shown in the map that poorer communities were disproportionately affected by all of these negative consequences of EV use. We started to see, by increased numbers in the EVs, by increasing the number of trips in private cars, kicking off these vicious cycles. So we like to call this the public transport death spiral, which is a bit melodramatic, but you know, it's really clearly comes out that this potential exists. As you increase the number of private car trips, you get increased congestion. Congestion on the roads has a really increases the variability of public transport journey time. That's known by the public transport providers themselves to be a key factor in people choosing to take public transport. The more variable the journey time, the less reliable the public transport is perceived as being, the lower its value for money is perceived as being. It becomes very unattractive. So people start to move away from public transport. Public transport revenue decreases, services are withdrawn, and hence the availability of public transport then decreases. Of course, this leads to more private cars, more trips in private cars. The whole cycle reinforces itself. So you essentially get public transport really being kind of driven down to a very low level, potentially, just by this increase in number of private vehicles. So it really has a magnifying negative effect, in fact. I mean, we can also use the maps, however, it's not just doom and gloom. We can use maps like this to pull out interventions that not only reduce carbon dioxide, but that also have multiple co-benefits or create virtuous cycles, positive self-reinforcing cycles that increase multiple beneficial outcomes. So this is not drawn from the map, it's just a little cartoon, but we essentially see that active travel really has those kind of self-reinforcing benefits in the maps that we see. We'll be further exploring to see where we can get other sorts of synergistic policy benefits from the map. So systems approaches, I think, are vital in any of these kind of big sustainability issues, and really crucial for looking at net zero. And I would say that this sort of approach of systems mapping is really useful for both national and local authority policy making. So one of the really powerful things that a technique like this does is it makes the complexity of the system strikingly visible. So it shows that there are no silver bullets. So when the map is built together with policymakers in the room, it's just really viscerally clear that your silver bullet policy is going to have all sorts of unexpected indirect effects. You have to take a systems approach. It also allows you to bring in different knowledge of how things work on the ground and how people might themselves react to policies in place. So bringing in this kind of practical knowledge actually is really vital to effective policy making. As well as this kind of really the useful aspects of just building the model together with diverse groups of people, policymakers and stakeholders, we really work with this method to tailor analysis to what is relevant to the given stakeholders or to the policymakers, and really produce actionable insights. And the analysis is very flexible and allows us to do that. So in policy contexts, we're often asking, what are the potential indirect effects of policy interventions or change scenarios? What, apart from what the policymakers are doing, are key influences on important policy outcomes? You know, what else do you need to know about in the system? What potential trade-offs or synergies between different outcomes and things that different stakeholder groups or actors value exist in the system? And really usefully, what might be potential policy levers that you can use to affect change in the system? or conversely, what might be key risks to your important policy outcomes that exist in the system. Moving on from that sort of basic analysis of what's going on already, we can use these methods and work with the methods to think about how we design effective interventions or strategies. So what can we do? We can use these maps to look at how we can mitigate unintended negative effects, trade-offs or risks, how we can capitalize on or create potential outcome synergies so that we get policies that increase all of the outcomes that matter to us, and how we can design interventions that really leverage the structure of the system, either using very influential factors as focal points, levers for change, or indeed disrupting or promoting feedback loops. So disrupting vicious cycles and creating virtuous cycles, which include the policy outcomes we care about. And finally, I think most of all, why this is really useful for policy making and in multiple domains, and it's particularly relevant to local authorities, I would say, is that it's a really fantastic method to encourage and allow participation. So it's a low-tech method. It can be done online or here, as you see, with post-its and magic whiteboard and markers, but it really allows people to come together and to construct a shared understanding of their complex system, builds people's ownership of the system in which they work and live. The models and analysis that we do can include what matters to different people, include their concerns. And when you do this process of modeling and analysis together with diverse types of people collectively increase their understanding of the system, but also each other's perspectives and expertise, and it really builds that sort of understanding. When we use the online version of these kind of maps that hopefully you'll see if you've accessed the link that got sent round, this is a technique that really allows people to explore their system's complexity in an accessible way. And I think ultimately where we'd like to go with this, and the sort of stuff we'd really like to work on next, is using these methods to collaboratively design complexity appropriate interventions and strategies that have multiple co-benefits and which work for everyone and for the whole system. Because when we're looking to get towards net zero, we can't afford to take an approach that doesn't look at the whole system. We are trying to build a whole new system here. We are not just focused on decarbonisation with all the unexpected effects that pop out when we just use our panaceas or silver bullets. So let's take a systems approach and let's make it accessible to everyone. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alex. And there have been a few questions on that we may wish to return to. I'm conscious of time, but just very quickly, obviously we're focused on carbon reduction here today, but do you use this systems mapping approach in other policy decisions, you know, maybe something like the location of a bus station or other transport policies, or has it been specifically for carbon reduction?
Oh, well, so the policy, transport policy work we've done has been looking at specifically at interactions between air quality, decarbonisation and mobility equity. So I think, but we've used it in all sorts of different domains. I mean, we used it with, with DEFRA, with BEIS, with DFT, with, every department on any kind of policy problem. So anything really that you can characterise as a complex system where interactions really matter, I think, between the different components in making effective decisions. That's where this is a useful approach. I mean, I think you probably would want to use more standard network analysis to look at, say, the positioning of a bus station. But it depends. If you're really kind of looking for co-benefits, different sorts of benefits from what you're doing, then an approach like this might well be useful in that scenario. I'd have to think a bit more deeply about that. But this is our first foray into transport with this. We've looked at mobility as a service also, but it's very broadly applicable. Yeah,
I can see that. And certainly, as you say, anything where there are interactions and you recognise the complexity of the system, then that is a very helpful way to look at it, I think. I appreciate there are some other comments and questions. Please do keep them coming in, but I think we would like to move on to our final speaker, so we've got time for a panel discussion. So thank you very much, Alex. And yes, I'll pass over to David now.
So yes, my name is David Connolly. I'm the Director of New Mobility at Systra, and I'm just going to wrap up the session with a quick rattle through the the idea of toolkits for developing good decarbonisation pathways for decarbonising transport as part of the route to net zero, and bring in some of our experience developing these toolkits and what else is available out there, basically, and work that's ongoing to develop these sorts of toolkits. So what features should there be of a toolkit and the measures within it? Well, obviously the measures have to be effective, because as we understand the scale of the problem, there is no room for things that don't deliver meaningful reduction in fossil fuel use, leading to the carbon footprint of travel. But also they have to be cost effective, because there is a limited budget for developing these things. So you can't just rely on big expensive schemes. It have to be measures that deliver significant carbon reduction per pound spent on those measures. So that is, the cost effectiveness is as important as the effectiveness of it, and you can't just rely on the big schemes. As we have heard, they have to be equitable and just. Because that leads to or helps them to be acceptable, but also means that politicians and others are more likely to agree to them, because you can show and demonstrate that they are fair. They are not just penalising the poor or the mobility limited, and those who can't afford electric vehicles and the like. Acceptable, I would argue that that's maybe one that we have to downplay, because the scale of the reduction in fossil fuel use and car use in particular is so high that the measures that are needed to deliver that will not be acceptable. In general, you will have to increase the cost of car use relative to what it is now. So I wouldn't overplay the acceptability, but obviously they're measures they have to have some ability to get them delivered and on the ground. But you cannot deliver what's needed by just doing nice things to the alternative modes. You will have to make the price of car use and fossil fuel use more expensive than it is now for the effectiveness to be there. Obviously, they can't rely on technical wishful thinking, if you like. So they have the measures that they have to be in the toolkit have to be technically feasible using technology that is available now, because the reductions are needed now, not in 10 years' time, basically. And related to that, deliverable, it's what you can deliver quickly will be a very useful measure of one of your tools, and not relying on, let's say, congestion charging or something that's maybe 10 years away, or hydrogen technology, which looks good, but it can't be delivered at the speed that's needed for the climate to reach the trajectory required. And in particular, there has to be things that will deliver the pain that's going to be needed, basically, to achieve typically the 20% reduction or more in car use. You cannot have a toolbox full of cycle lanes and attractive measures and free public transport, because we have, on a number of studies, we've tried that pain-free version, and it is, in my opinion, just won't work. So there will need to be some sticks in the toolkit. If you Google, or to save you the trouble, I've done it, if you look for online toolkit type work, there is the UK government has just announced a toolkit, local authority toolkit for transport decarbonisation. We, Systra, were very closely involved and delivered a 5-stage demand management study, which I'll talk about, which was delivered earlier this year and throughout last year. A very comprehensive consideration of measures, fiscal and local, and all aspects of tools and things that could deliver reduced demand for traffic, basically. The UK government also has help for local authorities on EV charging, which is obviously part of the question in terms of how you make EVs, the uptake of EVs as painless as possible for the part of the travel that can be solved by throwing more technology at the problem, more vehicles at the problem. And there are quite a number of detailed considerations of road user charging, which is one specific measure that might be considered for reducing car use, particularly as we move away from fossil fuel vehicles, and therefore the price of petrol becomes less useful as you move towards other fuel vehicles. So essentially, there's those 3 links at the top take you to those studies, and I would recommend them to you to check out what's available in terms of toolkits. UK government one also has a number of guidance documents produced by the DFT and the Energy Savings Trust. So active travel, car clubs, decarbonising road freight, demand responsive, lift sharing, and so forth. So generally all the things that are positive carrots, if you like, in almost every situation. So there's very little in there about how government can make it more expensive to park, for example, or to use cars or to own cars. And I do think that it's a little bit on the only good news side of things, but there is some very useful information within those guidance about how to deliver those measures that will increase the attractiveness of the more sustainable modes. So in my version, all of these are linked to those relevant websites, but if you can find one, you'll find them all because they're all available on the DFT site or the government site. Very quickly talking about the Irish 5 cities work. So this was, we started a couple of years ago when we did it, and the beauty of the working for the Department of Transport in Ireland was that they could consider national and regional and local measures, and in particular fiscal measures to change the cost of car use, whether that's the cost of buying a car or fuel price or road user charging or parking, as well as the measures which could identify improvements to cycling and public transport and the like. So we started with a very comprehensive literature review and international best practice. The final document that was over 100 pages, and almost every scheme that you might want is in there in terms of either a case study or with an evidence base, and it gives you a very good start to consideration of that wide, long list of things. But then the study went on further to home in on the ones that matched those various objectives. And it wasn't just carbon reduction, it was effectiveness and deliverability and health benefits and air quality and decongestion benefits, etc. So the full range, full multimodal appraisal, multi-criteria appraisal applied to that long list of measures to ultimately come up with a set of recommendations. And I say measures were broken down into fiscal things relating to air quality, including making it more expensive and less attractive to buy and or operate diesel vehicles in urban areas. And I should say that this study was very much focused on urban demand management rather than interurban or rural. So it was very much focusing on city centres in Ireland. So yeah, fiscal measures, air quality, things to do with traffic management and parking, both residential and destination parking, including workplace levies, planning policy in 20-minute neighbourhoods and the like, how much can that deliver in terms of reducing the need to travel or reducing the need to travel by car. Then what can you achieve with behavioural change and mode shift and making the alternatives attractive or the car use less attractive. And then what can technology and new technology, digital technology and the like do for including congestion charging schemes within a technology framework. So all of those measures were considered, and the strategy developed essentially a 3-tier approach, or a national pillar, or the pillars that would be fundamental to delivering what the level of change required, and then a more optional subset of tools that might be appropriate in different local situations, but again splitting that between a national level, the tier 2A schemes, which included fiscal measures and things affecting the price of car ownership and use, and more city level things where the local relevant city and the local authority could deliver them without national government getting behind them, basically. So that I haven't time to list everything that's in the toolkit, but the links there at the bottom of this slide will take you to that toolkit, and it is, as I say, a very comprehensive list of everything that you need to think about as a local authority or a regional body in terms of how you might deliver lower car use and lower vehicle use in general, particularly fossil fuel vehicles. I commend it to you. And I'm aware of at least 3 other studies that are going to be developing toolkits in the near future. Midlands Connect currently is out for tender, and bids are in for what they describe as the Decarbonisation Policy Playbook, which is very similar nature to that Irish work. So it's a sort of literature review and what will work, basically come up with a long list, and then subsequent phases will evaluate those and what provide the evidence base. TFN, Peter has talked already about his clean mobility visions, what should be in the things, because it's very hard to get the level of change that we're going to need to achieve the carbon pathway. So they're also commissioning a piece of work. And Transport Scotland are doing likewise, where they have a study out to get consultants to help analyse options for demand management that can deliver their target, which is for a 20% reduction in car kilometres in Scotland. There will be others, and perhaps we can use the question and answers to try and draw up a list. And I think it would be useful for us all to keep a list of those, so that we can not keep reinventing the literature review or the approach or the appraisal, that we can sort of build from one to the next, rather than it's all repeating the same sort of analysis. But that's just a very quick run through in my 10 minutes. I will now pass you back to Katie.
Thanks very much, David. And actually, I'm going to invite all of the panelists now to join me, so that we've got sort of half an hour or so for Q&A. I'll just remind everybody while everybody joins that all of the presentations and material will be available afterwards, and that you can also catch up on this and the other webinars that we've been doing on the YouTube channel, on the Landor LINKS. So that will all be available for you afterwards. But it's good to see everybody back. Thank you very much for really great presentations. If people do have questions that they'd like to put to the panel, then please put them in the question and answer conversation, and I'll see if I can get some. David, maybe we could just pick up on one specific for you, just in terms of the 5 city study for Ireland. What stage are we at now? Have any of the measures been implemented?
In the short answer, yes, they are starting now as part of their climate action plan, which we're also helping them with, where each of the local authorities is being tasked with developing strategies that will deliver the net, that their target is a 51% reduction in transport related emissions by 2030. And there is a gap in that we are trying to plug. It's with all the measures that we have identified for that climate action plan, there is still a gap, and part of that gap is how much are you willing to tell your citizens that the price of fuel will have to rise, basically. And if you aren't willing to tell them that, then there is a gap. And if you are willing to go take that approach, then you can close some of that gap. But that work is ongoing, and within that, the 5 cities that make up a lot of that urban area of Ireland, the urban traffic in Ireland, are considering using that basket of measures to develop their strategies to meet that 51% reduction in transport.
That is interesting. I'd kind of like to go back to that as well. Maybe we won't open up quite the road pricing debate just yet, but it may be linked just more generally to this sort of the link between getting all the analytical work done, but then actually getting recommendations implemented. Some of the comments have been that we seem to be very good at the analytical stage, but poor at getting the recommendations implemented. Do you agree?
That is part of the trouble with the road user charging, which it's probably much more equitable, but it will take so long to get it in that it's actually, my view is that you have to start by penalising the use of fossil fuel, and then as you move towards more use, you then move towards something that replaces the fuel duty and road user charging within that time and distance based road user charging. But we can't, in my opinion, wait for that to be the solution, basically, to targeting unnecessary car use. And there will be some people who have to make that, and I fully understand the equity issue, but if you don't increase the cost of car use very soon, we will not meet the target, basically. Absolutely.
Caroline, do you agree with that? Have you got anything else to add on the equity angle there?
I mean, I do take the point about the DIC. I think we can do a lot more to. I talked a lot about car dependence. We can do a lot more to help with that, to at least mitigate the problem. I think that there's possibly a case for, there's a case for increasing the cost driving, there is probably a simultaneous case for some sort of subsidy for some people, but really we need to be taking much more seriously looking at what we can do to reduce that reliance. It's, you know, I think we're quite well aware of it, but we in some ways shoot ourselves in the foot with some of the sort of ways of appraising things. So as I mentioned, the quantification in the wrong place. I think we could make some of these things a little bit easier for ourselves in terms of appraisal and thinking about what measures to implement. But certainly, you know, I do see that case for increasing the cost. There aren't any easy answers.
Yeah. And Peter, what about you as you try and move from strategy to action? What role does road pricing and equity play there?
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about the 2 C's, cost and convenience, and I think it has to play a role. I wouldn't necessarily call it road pricing. Actually, I think it's a fairer, proportionate pricing of all our different travel choices, so that they reflect their true costs. Because I think it's not just about road pricing; it's about the pricing of our public transport options too. But crucially, you've got to give a choice before you do that. And I think London did that well with the congestion charging scheme when they brought it in. At the same time, they brought in a raft of measures around the local bus network, increasing the number of routes, simplifying the fare structure, making it cheaper right at the beginning. So they increased that convenience of making those other choices. We can't just increase the cost, especially outside of London. We can't just increase the cost and not put in the provision of alternatives for people. So we've got to find the balance there.
And then just building on this, the conversation about funding as well, and making the case. Caroline, have you seen good examples or areas where we perhaps do need to focus on better quantification of social equity, of walking and cycling behaviour change interventions? Where are we at in terms of making progress on that?
I think there has been some really good progress. I think there's more and more recognition that it's not just enough to be encouraging, you know, sort of, here's the health benefits of walking and cycling, it's great, and, you know, it's not that dangerous really. That's not effective by itself. And I think we have made real progress there. You know, as I'll keep saying, it really is about the networks. It's almost the less glamorous things, just making sure those walking routes are continuous, looking at how, you know, whether people have got time to get across roads. This is where, you know, I think we do need to be doing much more. And it is a little bit difficult because it's harder to say, look what we've done with this intervention. So things like City Connect in West Yorkshire, that's a big flagship thing, but you know, looking at the gaps is, it's less glamorous, but arguably more important. I think that's where we need to be looking, and it is just shifting, you know, that quantification shift towards a sort of consistent policy, looking at the networks and looking at safety, you know, people feeling that they can use these routes.
Yes, exactly. Trying to capture the perception and reality of safety, I think, still could be more nuanced. I mean, David, have you got anything to add in terms of how carbon's treated in appraisal, perhaps, or generally funding?
There is a real issue, which is the cost of failing to achieve your carbon budget is not costed, and therefore quite often the best scheme is to do nothing rather than to add pain to people's journey or whatever, because the shadow price of the carbon or the price of the carbon saving does not reflect the cost of failing, you know, as a world effectively to meet that, and that's quite hard to build that in. How do you quantify that you need to achieve a given level, you know, at your local authority or within your region, and you'd probably adopt a critical success factor, which is you start with the assumption that allocation and that budget you have to meet, and therefore you're now choosing the strategy within that critical success factor that delivers that as painlessly as possible, or with as few losers as possible, rather than standard appraisal, which is basically everything. You're looking for things where everything's beneficial, and you end up that the best scheme in a carbon world is to do nothing, because that price of failure is not properly built into the appraisal. So I think you will have to adopt a critical success factor, which you've done a little bit in clean air zone work. Same idea, that you have to get compliant air quality. Now, how do you do that as well as possible? So I think there is some scope. I don't think current appraisal is very well geared up for the challenge of decarbonisation at speed, at the speed required, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting thing about a different starting point for it at all. And just returning to equity as well, is another question here about the use of local citizens' assemblies, perhaps to look at measures to reduce transport carbon emissions. Do you think that would promote a fairer outcome? Is that practical? Alex, maybe you could be interested on your view on that, particularly in terms of using the whole systems approach. Is it something that you think could work with the public, with local citizens?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and in other domains we've used it with the public, and I would see citizens' assemblies as a really great place to use these methods, because they are accessible, relatively low tech, and but they give people the knowledge that they need, or the sort of system perspective that they need to actually, rather than just looking at their own interests, to see how what they do interacts with others and with the whole system. And I think we actually really, to kind of move forward on this, we really need to be looking at approaches for participatory complexity, for people themselves being able to work with experts and with policymakers to develop a mutual understanding of the constraints and perspectives, so that that we try to do this collaboratively. And it's a very different model, using this kind of participatory approach of working together, everyone gaining an understanding of the system, everyone's knowledge coming in, being brought to bear. So yeah, I mean, personally, if anyone wants to offer us an opportunity to do this in a citizens' assembly or a climate assembly, we'll be there. But yeah, I think it could be extremely useful. It's a workshop like this you can do in a few hours, really, or several workshops of a few hours. So you can actually, and then build a model that people can work with in the long term and have as a living document themselves. So it's really well suited, I think, to that kind of thing.
Thank you. And other panelists, positive, negative experiences of Peter.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring it up, because we're actually at TFN looking to pilot some assemblies and panels, which is a sort of a different format, which is slightly a wider range, well, a wider grouping of participants, but less detail. For issues wider than just around decarbonisation. But I think it is an interesting one. I think anecdotally, when you look at the assemblies that have happened already, particularly the UK-wide one, I think many were surprised by some of the outcomes from that. For instance, the acceptability around no new airport expansion, for example. And I think also anecdotally that we, local councillors and perhaps us as the public, and what we see in the media is an amplified vocal minority when it comes to views around things like parking charges and road user charging and things like that. But actually, more in-depth research by companies like Ipsos Mori has shown that the acceptability for some element of road pricing is actually much greater for the general public than perhaps you might think. And I think that's what those citizens' assemblies can actually give some level of assurance to local politicians about what actually their communities want, rather than what just hits their mailbox day after day from the same vocal minority. So I think I'm really supportive of that approach, but it has to be proportionate as well. It's not the cheapest and easiest thing to do, actually, for some of these citizens' assemblies, I think. And if we can make sure that that there's an easy, there's a clear route to doing that for local authorities, that it's made proportionate, and or that regional bodies can undertake that for them, perhaps as their role, then that would be a useful thing to do.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I think it brings up an interesting question about the speed of activity as well. One of the questions in the chat about how can we speed up sort of implementation, particularly on infrastructure. But I think you know, it could be a double-edged sword in terms of engagement as well when that's done at the right time, that sort of thing. Caroline, perhaps to you first. Are there any sort of good examples or suggestions you've got for how we can actually speed up implementation around infrastructure, active travel infrastructure in particular?
That's a really tough one. It's we're going to need a shift in so many of our priorities. It's I don't know. It's a really difficult question. But I think, yeah, just to sort of take on the scale of what we need to do, we need to recognise that something needs to change, and as much as, yeah, it's that's not a very good answer, but I do think we just need to recognise that we are not succeeding and that we do need to change, and that is going to be quite a tough decision.
Yeah, absolutely. It's if it was easy, we might have got a bit further already. I don't know, David, if you've got anything to add as well on that front. Just how can we get moving on some of these things?
I mean, the problem is that you don't notice your carbon, that you've exceeded your budget, and there, you know, the report comes out and it's, oh dear, we haven't met our target, and you know, it's connecting that the big problem with the need to, you know, to reduce car kilometers by 20% or whatever it might be. Whilst everybody says that's great, we should do that, but by the way, I'm just going to jump in the car and drive to the supermarket or whatever. So you know, it's connecting. And I think it needs more vision from politicians and possibly local authorities. We will make this city cycle friendly. We will take away road space from cars, and we're going to do it because we have to, not because it's popular. And it might become popular, and it probably is popular if you speak to the right people, but we're going to do it anyway. And I think we are, in this country, we're very short of sorry, that's not true. There are some local authorities better than others at this, and I think they will all have to get that behind that, where the car is no longer what you're trying to serve. You're trying to cope with the car and reduce the car's use of that road space so that it's available for placemaking and active travel and green what I would call green infrastructure and all the rest of it. That has to come in city centres. It's not as obvious that solves all of the carbon emissions, but very much that is, we need a bit of more willingness to go that, because we have to, basically, in that message. And I think it's actually that the messaging still isn't strong enough. I don't think people get it as to what they need to do, basically. And I could be wrong, but I don't think that message has come out strong enough. And you know, even in Clean Air Zone, you know, in fact, there isn't a sort of national campaign telling you not to buy a diesel vehicle, and B, not to drive it in an urban area. Why is that message not just, you know, right up there?
Yeah.
And it's not weak politicians, but nervous politicians, shall we say, basically.
Yeah.
Not want to criticize politicians too much, but anyway, nervous politicians.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And maybe it links slightly to the question here about, you know, can we actually control carbon without rationing? What does the panel think on that? No. Anybody else got a view? Do we need rationing? Peter?
I've sort of referred to carbon budgets in my presentation, and I think they've got yes, we do need carbon budgets. People need to be able to contextualize their carbon. That's what a carbon budget gives you.
Yeah.
But I think there's two sides to that. There's carbon budgets for businesses, for sectors, for programs, projects, and then there's the concept of the personal carbon budget. And I think that's much more difficult. We know that the highest income groups in our society and globally are the people using far more of the carbon, the overall carbon budget. So you think, oh, well, if everyone had the same carbon budget, surely that's a much more just way of, and, you know, more of their carbon was allotted to others who you know, in lower income group, that's a more just way of doing it. But then you do have people who, you know, for instance, they have to drive for their work, or, you know, they may have caring responsibilities when they have to take a car, or, you know, they can't afford to get solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. And so how do we equate that with a personal carbon budget? So I think that's really, really difficult, the personal carbon budget element. And I was just wanting, I don't want to go backwards, but I think this thing about communication is so important. There's lots of people like David, like me, and like yourself in this industry, and we're all agreeing with each other. But actually, the most important people in this whole picture for me are those working in comms and marketing and engagement. I think most people still don't understand what the implications of climate change are, let alone what they need to do. And we know that society is galvanized by understanding how it's going to impact upon them. So I completely agree with David. Where are the national campaigns on this? You know, and from the national campaigns, then it's much easier to filter down to local campaigns, marketing, and so on.
Yeah, agreed. And I think related to that, it is sort of, it's very hard to conceptualize, I think, for some people, and that makes that message even more difficult. And I guess there's also another consideration here, question about how much consideration there is for future uncertainty in these net zero plans as well. So what happens if you get low GDP growth, or, you know, the electric shared autonomous vehicles is different to what you imagined, changing costs in batteries, there's still quite lots of developing trends and uncertainties. So how is that sort of dealt with in these plans? David, do you want to kick off on that one?
It's just, I would focus on the certainty, which is that we are creating climate change. We need to reduce our carbon now. Whether you need to reduce it by 51 or 55% is neither here nor there. Let's start off aiming for 51, and if we overshoot, well and good, sort of thing. So I think you could, if you let uncertainty mean you do nothing, then you would have been better just to go with your central estimate and crack on, basically. So we will have time to adapt the plans, but we don't have time to do nothing, I think, is in short. So we can adapt. As it turns out, everybody buys an electric car, and 90%, you know, we treble cycling in every town in the country. Excellent. We don't have to try quite so hard with freight or whatever it might be, but we do have to start, and we have to assume that it's what the Committee on Climate Change and other learned organizations tell us we have to do to car kilometers, vehicle kilometers, fossil fuel kilometers, and use that central estimate, and then monitor very closely all the things that you've assumed about the uptake of electric vehicles and car use and all the rest of things. You can monitor and adapt as you go, but you've got to start. You can't use uncertainty as an excuse for doing nothing, basically, in my opinion.
Is there any further comment anybody would like to make on uncertainty there? Caroline, perhaps? You're coming in. I couldn't hear you for a moment there. I think you've, okay.
It's incredibly important. I know that there's some work going on looking at different scenarios.
Sorry, Caroline, I think we're losing, for me anyway, I'm losing sound there. So maybe you...
Is it still not?
It's quite faint.
Okay.
Shout to us.
There's work going on looking at different scenarios, so taking account of uncertainty. We know that we're terrible at forecasting and that the world's uncertain. What we can do with this is, I think, look at avoiding some of the really high risk strategies, which are around, relying on technology. So something like zero, which is, it might happen, but I wouldn't put money on it. And we know what low carbon mobility, we know what definitely will work, and it is the walking and cycling, public transport, and reducing travel demand. And under different scenarios, that's going to be effective. The high risk strategies really leave us very, very stuck. There's also a whole load of uncertainties around social inclusion, around different aspects of social sustainability with those. So absolutely take account of uncertainty and think about what are the risky strategies and what are the less risky strategies given that, and what allows some adaptation. So again, if we're putting everything into very high risk strategies, there's very little scope to change when things don't turn out as we planned. And however many different scenarios we have, we can bet it's going to be something we haven't thought of. So let's think about what's going to work under as many different possible cases
Yeah, thank you. I think I picked up most of that in terms of, as you say, maybe focusing on lower risk strategies and being aware of those strategies that don't allow you the flexibility to adapt in case, yeah. I'm conscious of time. There are lots of questions that unfortunately we haven't been able to cover, but I think hopefully we've picked up many of the key points. I might just like to finish on a bit of a broader question for everybody. Really thinking about what quick wins there would be if you had the lucky job of being Secretary of State for Transport. You know, what things would you focus on to reorientate the national transport policy for England towards net zero? So sort of what are your top 3 priorities? And perhaps I could go around the panel. It's a tricky one. I'll start with Peter, sorry.
I'm really split, because unlike David, I do think looking at proportionate pricing of our travel choices is going to be the key. But because everybody always says something around that, I'm going to say communication. So how can they better get the urgency out there? So a campaign of a sort of COVID style campaign of marketing and engagement around the need for climate change and the potential implications would be a really good short-term action.
Great, thank you. Alex, can I come to you next?
Okay, this is a really difficult question, actually. So actually, one of the things I would say is, without decreasing the sense of urgency, one of the most important things for policymakers to do is not to panic. You know, is to sit and think a little bit more before introducing policy. We've got such a long list of policies in multiple domains which get implemented. There are some sort of potential negative side effects. We kind of know they're there, but we know we've got to focus on optimizing one particular variable. So we just go for it and we're doing something. And then we just have to withdraw the policy a few years later. That doesn't serve us. We need to actually get used to thinking, reflecting, looking at the whole system, collaborating with other departments, and actually thinking like what would be the best, most effective thing that we could do, both combine, you know, thinking about what the system structure is and the impact of policy, but also what we are able to influence within the system. Just that little bit of thoughtfulness injected into policy is what we really try to encourage, and I think that's the most crucial thing to go for, to be honest.
Thank you. Caroline, if we can hear you, then what's your quick win?
Okay, so I think my first policy would be to absolutely prioritise creating a safe walking environment from anywhere to anywhere.
Is that a safe walking environment? It is. I think the sound's getting worse, but I'm maybe my lip reading's getting better.
And every time we come up against a barrier that says we can't do this because it will disrupt the traffic, it will be it's not cost effective, rethink the way we're making those decisions. So we have to get this right. And if our sense of, if our appraisal tools, if our idea of priorities is getting in the way of that, we need to think that. And I think that quite a lot of what we're doing, it's not just about the politics, it's being stuck in, ways of thinking about what's possible and what's not possible. That needs rethinking.
Thank you. I think, again, appraisal tools and the importance of trying to pick up some of those, the quantification of those other benefits. Hopefully I've paraphrased that from what I've picked out. David, I'll come to you finally then.
I would do 2 if I can. One would be just to improve the link between planning and transport. Stop building houses where the only way you can get from the house to your primary school and the shop and everything else is by driving, basically. So just and retrofit where you can into your 20-minute neighborhood idea. So just reduce the need to drive everywhere, basically. And then find a way of increasing the cost of car use where there is an alternative, and whether that's urban parking, the cost of the second car ownership, fossil fuel price, etc. Just generally target and find ways of mitigating for those who A, are low income, and B, have no alternative but to drive. Find a way of subsidizing those to make up for the fact that you've made the choice much more balanced towards the mode or the journey that does not generate the carbon that you get from burning petrol in a combustion engine, basically.
Thank you. Well, that takes us to 12 o'clock, and I know that we should try and keep on. I appreciate everybody's interest and contribution today, and particularly want to thank all the panelists for their really interesting presentations and for engagement on the Q&A. Hopefully not too many curveballs for you, and yeah, there's certainly a lot more questions, as I said. If we're able to respond to those, we will do, and we will share the materials that we've presented today as well. So I think that just leaves me to say thank you again to everybody.
And sorry, Kate, you're going to say that everything's been recorded as well. The recordings
right.
are available, so you can listen to it all again, or you can make the recordings available to your colleagues if they weren't able to join us.
Indeed, and that includes the other sessions that we've had in the series as well, where we've covered some more specific topics in the run-up to COP. So I would encourage you to take a look back at those ones as well. But otherwise, I shall leave you all to have good days, and thank you very much for joining us today.